Hi, welcome to the program. I'm Bob Crimmins, and this is the television version of Living in the West. Well, Living in the West is a television program, of course, but it's also online. You can find it very easily by just going to livinginthewest.com. They've been in publication for 25 years now. That's an awful long time. And they have 22 great writers, and I am one of those writers, and I write about health issues and I write about history articles as well. But you can go over there and read articles, things like health, glamour, nostalgia, medical issues, comics, movie stars. They have the whole thing there for you. So go on over and take a look, and I'm sure you'll get hooked to it because it's a fun magazine to read. Just go over to livinginthewest.com and pick out whatever it is that interests you most. So we're going to get into the program today, and I've invited Steve Beck from Sutter's Fort to be with me again. And Steve and I in the past have done programs on things like the Bear Flag Revolt and the Donner Party. And also I did a program on the Transcontinental Railroad and all things about the West. Well, today we're going to be telling you a story of how Sacramento actually got started. I mean, we all live here, but how did this place get started? Well, I think you're going to find out that it was very, very difficult to get this place going. And I think, in fact, if I would have been around in those days, I think I just might have left and said, you guys get it set up, I'll be back later. But boy, the things that this town had to go through were just overwhelming. And those people must have just had courage and pure guts to stick it out and actually build this town for us. So at this time now, I'm going to introduce my guest, Steve. Hi, welcome to the program.
Hi, Bob. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining me again, Steve. And like I say, we were going to talk about how Sacramento got started. And I bet you if you were to go out there today and ask 100 people that question, they wouldn't really have an idea. Well, yeah, it was a long time ago. Well, yeah, I know it was a long time ago, but what happened a long time ago, you know? So you put together a bunch of pictures for us, like you always do, and you're going to tell us the story of how this happened, starting even with John Sutter right at the very beginning. And as people can tell, we've got a picture of the state capitol showing behind us there. So it kind of goes from point A to the state capitol. And so if you would like to get started now and show us just how this wonderful town of ours did, in fact, get its roots and get started that we all love so much today.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank the publishers of Living in the West magazine for inviting me to share these history sessions with you and for making them available to students of history, of California history. And yes, you know, Sacramento is a lot more than just the gold rush. In fact, our story is going to begin in 1803 in a small village of Kandern, located near the Tri-Country region in the Black Forest of Germany, where Switzerland, Germany, and France all come together with the birth of Johann Augustus Sutter. Of course, we know him today as John Sutter. So this is 1803, and this is the age of Napoleon. And Sutter was amazed by the uniforms of the soldiers that marched through his town. It gave him a feeling of confidence. He saw the respect that these people got and how good they looked, and he understood a military bearing. He went to a military school. He was trained in military ways. He learned to talk the talk and walk the walk. But something happened that altered his life. He was born to a middle-class family, and with the defeat of Napoleon, we're going to see, first of all, what the face of Europe looked like when we had all of these small countries. One of those little pink countries up there is or brown country is the Grand Duchy of Baden, which is actually where Sutter was born, just above Switzerland. But with the defeat of Napoleon and with the map of Europe changing, all of a sudden there was no longer a need for big standing armies, and the second sons of the era of the middle class, like John Sutter, or even the sons of the middle class, suddenly had very little opportunity. Only first sons inherited property under land tenancy laws, and second sons went into the military, and third sons went into the clergy. But with the economic depression that followed, Sutter had very little opportunity. So Sutter decided to head to the New World. And this is a picture of how John Sutter looked actually in 1839, but he does cut a dashing figure in his uniform. Then Sutter, on his trip to the New World, took a rather circuitous route that included stops in New York and then to Kansas City, or Westport as it was known at the time. And from Westport, he became involved in a mercantile trade where he would take raw materials to Santa Fe, Mexico, now New Mexico, and exchange them for raw materials that he would take back to Westport to sell at a profit. But it was during these journeys that two things happened to Sutter. One, he found out about the free availability of land in California and the fact that there was very little government there to protect that land, Bob. And he also found out that, that he could find a way to make money out on the frontier. And he decided to go to the Wind River Mountain Rendezvous of 1838. And so Sutter traveled overland from Kansas City with other traders to the Rocky Mountains, and then once in the Rocky Mountains, meeting up with other trappers who told him about the ease of getting to California, or at least to the Pacific coast. Sutter decided to trade his goods not for raw materials to take back to Kansas City, but rather for an Indian guide and the equipment to travel overland. And he traveled overland to Fort Vancouver. But it was also during this time that he was able to use his military training. Having gone to military school and having been educated to speak and write 4 different languages before he even came to the New World, Sutter realized he could take on the persona of captain. Being a captain in the Swiss Guard sounds a lot better, Bob, when he's going to meet fort people than John Sutter, broke dry goods salesman. So taking this captain persona to heart, Sutter gave himself a military title to go with his military bearing. Once he was in Vancouver, he found out that he could not get to California from there, and so Sutter traveled to Hawaii. Now, in Hawaii, he spent about 6 weeks, and fortunately, he had just missed the ship to California because the Yankees, the Americans from the East Coast, were the only ones who really went to California. They were going there to sell manufactured goods and to pick up hide and tallow. Those were the only businesses that existed in California at that time. But having missed the boat, Sutter was not able to get to California from Hawaii. Instead, he went to Sitka, Alaska. And then from Sitka, Alaska, he got involved with the Russian-American Fur Company. And either because the Russians in Sitka hated him or liked him, they gave him a ship to get to California. Here, Sutter, take our ship. All you have to do is bring it back when you're finished and drop off supplies at our fort, Fort Ross, on the coast of California, and check in at the customs house in Monterey to declare your cargo. So now Sutter was set to go finally to achieve his dreams in California. And he took off, but he dropped off supplies at Fort Ross, but rather than going into Monterey, he stopped first at the small village of Yerba Buena. That's the picture you see on the screen now. A town of less than 200 people when Sutter got there in 1839. We now know it as the city of San Francisco. It was a major stopping point for ships picking up fresh water on the West Coast, but Sutter was there long enough to give letters of introduction that he had acquired from the Hudson Bay Company in Hawaii and from the Russian commandant in Sitka. So Sutter had this bearing that allowed people to recognize his greatness before he even achieved that greatness. They gave him letters of introduction that then made him a prominent citizen. However, he wasn't supposed to stop in San Francisco, or Yerba Buena, Good Herb as it was known in 1839, and he was ordered by the authorities to head on to Monterey to check in. So before he ever rounded Point Pinos and sailed into the village of Monterey, a town of about 600 people and the capital of Mexican California, John Sutter knew the culture from having stopped in Yerba Buena. So he sent the whaleboat ahead with an emissary to announce the arrival of Captain John Sutter of the Swiss Guard, and on his ship, which is really the Russian ship, that night, they are going to have a big party Because Sutter's in California looking for free land, and he wants to impress the people of California that he's worthy of being given this land. Now, the California, though, into which Sutter's going to be journeying is not the Mission California and the Spanish developments that we know along the coast. Instead, it's the interior, an interior that's inhabited by the native people. We would call them California Indians. And at the time Sutter arrived, and before 1834 smallpox epidemic, was about the largest hunting and gathering society in the history of humanity. So Sutter was going to travel into a densely populated Indian region. So densely populated that when they tried to map this, and the map that you see right now was done by A.L. Kroeber, the first chair of anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. He, around the turn of the 20th century, sent out students to take linguistics studies, and from that he determined that there were about 96 subdivisions of California Indians. But frankly, you could subdivide it another 90 times and not get the diversity of the California Indian population. And yet, even though we subdivide them into language groups and give them specific regions, by the time Sutter arrived in California, the Indian population had become even more diverse by intermingling. Now, the Spanish and the Mexicans had developed the coast and had established the mission system. There were some Indians who adopted the mission system and were willingly moving in to have access to Western goods and Western customs and a new god. But this is a picture of the San Francisco Presidio, and you'll notice that the native people in the bottom of this picture are not having a very good time. They've been rounded up. They've been forced into the mission. And those Indians that did not want to be forced into the mission system had to escape. And of course, the map of California as it looked in 1839 shows you that all the development in California is along the coast. Now, Sutter's Fort, which you do see in the interior, which was not there when John Sutter, of course, first arrived in Monterey, is the only development. But the Mexicans and the Spanish before them had only developed the coast of California. So Sutter was willing to go into the interior. But before him, the native people who did not want to be a part of the mission system had escaped to the interior. And they brought horror stories with them of what was happening on the coast. This is how Sutter looked probably in his favorite picture. This is actually a picture of him as a general in the California militia, but he did have a fancy uniform for himself even at the time he arrived in California, when he had taken on this fake persona of being a captain in the Swiss Guard. And this is Juan Alvarado. He was the governor of California. This is the man that Captain Sutter was going to approach to ask for free land. And of course, when he did approach Alvarado and said he wanted some free land, the first reaction was a chuckle, Bob. At that point, Alvarado's telling Sutter, you know what, we have already subdivided the land as much as we can, and what land is left is going to go to our children. But when Sutter says he doesn't want that land, that he wants to go to the interior, it makes an entire difference in the Mexican perspective of what Sutter's trying to achieve. In fact, when he says he wants to go up the Sacramento River, where no one has yet established anything, it is Alvarado's wish that Sutter succeed. In fact, they give him the largest land grant available under Mexican law, 11 square leagues, over 48,000 acres or over 75 square miles, because they thought there was only one of three things that would happen to Sutter. One is he would be chased off. That would be what happened to everyone else who had tried to settle the interior. Or two, he might get killed. So what? They've already told him that there's no available land on the coast. Or three, he might actually build a small settlement of his own, and then the Indians that have been raiding the coast might raid his establishment instead of theirs. But there's nothing square about the land that Sutter set out. When Sutter actually got into the Central Valley, he had his land grant surveyed by a man named Jean-Jacques Viager. And this is a map of that original survey. This is actually a copy of the map that was made in 1853 for the Lands Commission. But you'll notice that New Helvetia, which is what Sutter called his settlement, New Switzerland, there was a reason for that other than his Swiss background. But what it is a chunk of land in the south where Sacramento is today, up the Sacramento River to the confluence of the Feather River, and then up the Feather River and up the Sacramento River to a point of latitude that is now known as the Sutter Buttes. And this is where Sutter established his land grant of New Helvetia. And it was Sutter in this land grant that was looking to develop a new life for which he could then send his family. So, why did John Sutter succeed in building a permanent settlement in the Sacramento Valley after other people had tried and failed? He wasn't the first. Jose Gabriel Moraga was the first. He came in here in 1806. So why did John Sutter build a permanent settlement, Bob? Why do you think that happened? How could he do it after others had tried and not succeeded? The first that had tried was in 1808, 1806. Jose Gabriel Moraga had come in. He named the Sacramento River and the American River, although he had named it Rio de las Llagas, or River of Sorrow, because some of his soldiers were killed by Indians on its bank. He also named the Feather River Rio de los Plumas. But why did Sutter succeed after all of these early explorers had failed? And this is a map that shows you all the different explorers that had come in. And they had tried many times prior to Sutter's arrival in 1839 to settle it. So when Sutter got here in mid-August of 1839, why did he succeed when others failed? Did he have a big army with him, do you think? Sutter's party consisted of himself, 10 Hawaiians, 2 of whom were women, and 2 German sailors. Hardly an invasion force. 13 people is all Sutter had when he landed on the banks of the American River near where his fort is today. What Sutter did differently than all the others was Sutter was able to make friends with the local Indians. How he did this, we're really not sure. One thing is he did offer them pay. Now, was it much pay? Nah, not much. We didn't pay much for Manhattan Island either. But he did offer them steel knives. He offered them cloth in exchange for their labor. And it was Sutter's ability to get along with the native people that really made him successful in the development of the Sacramento Valley. This is John Bidwell. John Bidwell was one of the first people to arrive in the Sacramento Valley. That was an immigrant from the United States. How was Sutter going to get wealthy? How was he going to make money? I mean, the only way Sutter could make money living amongst all of these native people was to make a farm that could then produce agricultural products or manufactured goods that could be sold. But to do that, he had to have an influx of people from the outside. He needed to attract immigrants. So he began advertising free land and a free start in the ranching business. A society was formed in Missouri known as the Western Migration Society. Over 500 people belonged. John Bidwell was a member. They had agreed to meet on the banks of the Missouri River in 1841 to come to California to take Sutter up on his offer. 34 of those 500 actually made it. John Bidwell was one of those. It was Bidwell who told Sutter what the problem was. John Bidwell told Sutter that the people were afraid of Indians. So how do you make people feel safe? You throw up 18-foot-high mud walls, you mount 14 cannon around them, only 3 of which work, and you draw pictures of your fort. This is one of the pictures of what Sutter's fort looked like. There are no photographs from the time. This is another picture, and this is another rendition of how Sutter's fort looked. But by building a fort, Sutter gave people the pretense of safety, and the overland migration began. But let's back up to the Bidwell. Now, of course, Bidwell was the founder of the city of Chico and Chico State University. But I also want to show you that another member, this is Fort Ross. before we go on to the other members. The Fort Ross is important for John Sutter's establishment in Sacramento, or in Sutter's Fort, because in 1841, based upon his relationship with the Russians, and Fort Ross was the Russian settlement in California to which Sutter had to deliver goods, Sutter was able to purchase Fort Ross from the Russians. He disassembled it and brought it to his fort. Consequently, he was able to build a fort in a short period of time. Now, the woman that you just saw on the screen, that was Nancy Kelsey. And Nancy Kelsey was part of the Bidwell Party. She was Well, this is an interesting story because she's often left out of the history books. And this is one of the more heroic stories of our time, because the Bidwell Party consisted not just of John Bidwell and 31 other men. It consisted of Nancy Kelsey, who was pregnant and carrying her 3-year-old daughter with her. Their wagons didn't make it because there weren't any roads. They had to eat their horses, their oxen, and even their dogs. But they made it safely to California, and Bidwell told Sutter he needed a fort. This is Pearson Redding. Now, after Nancy Kelsey and the Bidwell Party had made it, people realized the journey could be made safely, and they began coming in greater numbers. Pearson Redding, the city of Redding, is built on his Cottonwood Ranch, got here in 1843. He was a clerk for John Sutter. This is Peter Lassen. Red Bluff is built on his land. Lassen National Park, Lassen County, Lassen Peak are all named for him. He was a clerk for John Sutter. This is Sam Brannan. This is Sam Brannan. And Sam Brannan came to California in 1846 by ship on the Brooklyn. Sam Brannan was a Mormon. He was bringing a contingent of Mormons to California to establish a new Zion, or a new hope. This was going to be the new homeland for the Mormons who have been chased out of Illinois. But before that, Brannan became a clerk for John Sutter, and he owned a store just outside of Sutter's Fort. This is William Leidesdorff. Now, William Leidesdorff was not a clerk for John Sutter, but he was a man who acquired the second land grant from Sutter in the region. His land grant represented what is now the cities of Rancho Cordova and Folsom. He was also the government representative of several European nations and was the vice consul for the United States in Mexican California. What's interesting about Mr. Leidesdorff is he is a black man. It's hard to tell from this picture, but Mr. Leidesdorff's mother was a full-blooded Creole from the West Indies. His father was either a Dutch trader or part Creole and part Dutch trader. It's hard for us to know now because history books are written by the people who write them and by the victors. But a large percentage of the population of California when John Sutter arrived in 1839 and up through the migration until the gold rush were people of African descent. Because when slavery was made illegal in 1834 in the West Indies, many of them traveled to California. This next picture is Mariano Vallejo. Mariano Vallejo, despite being in the suit in this picture, was the military commandant of the Northern Department of the Army of Mexico. He had taken and fortified the barracks at Sonoma. However, when I say fortified and when I say army, we need to do that with a disclaimer. In fact, he had a very small army that was stationed there. This is John C. Fremont, and John C. Fremont was an explorer. He was here in 1846, here being California, on a mapping expedition. What's unusual about this is that Fremont had already been here in 1844 and had already mapped California. So when he returned in 46, he was leading a contingent of 63 hardened mountain men who were selected not for their ability to shoot a gun, not for their ability to draw a map, but rather for their ability to shoot a gun. He is known to history as the Pathfinder, but is more likely called the Path Marker, because there was no place that that Kit Carson did not lead him. Now, Fremont and Kit Carson represented the American Army, although Carson separated himself from the Army to help in what became a revolution in California. Because on June 14th, 1846, in the pre-dawn hours, a bunch of American and European settlers from Sutter's Fort and from the Napa Valley attacked the Mexican military headquarters at Sonoma and conquered the entire Mexican army. All 12 of them. They had to awaken them at Vallejo's headquarters to tell them that they were under attack. And this is the Bear flag that was created. Now, Bob and I have done a previous show on the Bear flag that can give you more details about it. It's interesting to note, though, that the bear was chosen because it's strong, it doesn't back down in the face of the enemy. The star was done in honor of Texas, which had been the Lone Star Republic, but had become a state in December of 1845, and was now, California was going to be the new Lone Star Republic. The stripe on the bottom, made of red flannel, stood for the blood they were willing to shed to keep California free and independent. Interesting to note that the red flannel came from the underwear of Uncle Billy Elliot. Talk about giving it all up for the rebellion. And the bear on the flag, which does not look like a ferocious grizzly bear, looks more like a pig, was drawn, and the flag designed by William Todd, who happened to be the nephew of Abraham Lincoln. What's important about this Bear Flag Rebellion, and wouldn't be very popular to be from the Pig Flag Republic, though, would it? Is that the men who participated in the Bear Flag Rebellion then became the California Battalion, because the Bear Flag Republic lasted a mere 3 weeks. It was declared on June 15th, 1846. By July 7th, 1846, the American Navy sailed into Monterey and raised the American flag. The men that had been part of the Bear Flag now became part of the California Battalion under the command of Fremont, and the Mexican-American War was on. This is Commodore Stockton on the top. He was the leader of the American forces, and on the bottom is Jose Castro. He became the leader of the Mexican forces because Vallejo himself did not want to engage the Americans. Vallejo was actually supporting the annexation of California into the United States, but Castro led the Mexican forces against the Americans. This is Edward Kern. It was during this time that Sutter's Fort took on a new life. It changed from the agricultural and manufacturing center led by John Sutter to Fort Sacramento. Renamed by Fremont, it became the headquarters of the Mexican Army and Navy during the Mexican-American War. And Edward Kern, of whom Kern County is named, was actually put in charge of Sutter's Fort during this. This is the fort as it looked in its heyday during this Mexican-American War time. Notice the soldiers drilling, and notice the buildings that surrounded the fort. It wasn't just a complex by itself, but there were at least 30 adobe structures that surrounded the fort by itself. You can see a couple of them in that picture. This is the 28-star flag that was raised above Sutter's Fort. Texas had just recently become the 28th state, and they had to send up an extra star to be added to this flag. This is General Stephen Watts Kearny. He was in charge of the Army of the West. They were going to march from Missouri to California to secure California for the United States. But on the way here, he met up with Kit Carson, who had been sent back east to announce that Fremont and Stockton had already secured California. So Kearny left most of his forces behind as he marched on to California. But what he found is, this is a map of Southern California. The bay you kind of see there in the middle bottom of the map is San Diego. When Kearny entered into California, the war was back on. From the time Carson had left until he met up with Kearny, the Mexicans who had surrendered took up arms again. This is the Battle of San Pasqual. It's the bloodiest battle fought between armies in California. The bad news, I guess, is it's the bloodiest battle. The good news is only 21 people died. 2 of them were Californios, or officially Mexican soldiers, 21 of them were Americans. The only guy to die from a musket wound that day was the American leading the charge at San Pasqual. The others died from lance wounds. The Californios were extremely good lancers because they learned how to use them in the cattle industry. Kearny himself received several lance wounds but survived, but he did suffer the entire time he was in California. This is a map of what the United States acquired with the victory during the Mexican-American War that ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, February 2nd, 1848. The dark line that you see running up from between Louisiana and Texas represents the border of that land. So with the defeat of Mexico, the United States acquired most of Texas, all of New Mexico, parts of Oklahoma, large parts of Colorado, all of Utah, parts of Wyoming, most of Arizona, and all of California. It's often known as the Mexican Secession. This is the next map we're going to see is from John Bidwell. This is a map that the United States Army asked him to draw so that he could show the people that were in the Central Valley prior to the Mexican Secession. You'll notice that New Helvetia is the dark spot and the center of this, but everyone else were acquired land grants from John Sutter. Remember, Sutter was offering free land and a free start in the ranching business. And once he built his fort, the migration grew from those 34 people that we saw in the Bidwell party to each year got more until the year 1846, the year of the Mexican-American War, when people feeling that there could be a new life in California that could be American began to come in droves. There was almost a traffic jam from the Missouri River to Sutter's Fort. A lot of that was done by this man. This is Lansford Hastings, and he wrote a book called An Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. And in this guide, Hastings told people how to get to California, what supplies they needed, and where they could find grass for their oxen, etc. But Hastings was being paid by Sutter for every family that he could come get to live in California. Now, Hastings' name is associated with another unfortunate event in California history, or in immigrant history. Hastings Cutoff, which was supposed to be a shortcut to California, but in fact turned out to be a very difficult long cut, one that's generally associated with the Donner Party. This is James Reed and his wife Margaret. They were key members of what is now called the Donner Party, but James Reed was really the organizer of that party, and it was Reed who talked everybody into coming to California. Now, what's interesting here is Hastings is often blamed for the Donner Party travails and the entrapment in the mountains because of his shortcut, but it was the leader of the first party that got to California that year, the Harlan Party, was actually Lansford Hastings himself, who had advised the Donner Party to not go that way. Now, we have already done a video on the Donner Party, and you can watch that if you'd like to learn more information about them. Perhaps the most famous part of the Donner Party, this is Patty Reed and her small doll, Dolly. Now, in this picture, it doesn't look small, but it's actually less than 4 inches tall. She kept this doll in her pocket and share the stories of their adventures on the trail and their entrapment in the mountains with the doll. The doll is now on display daily at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. Now, the next picture that we're going to see, this is James Marshall. This is probably the best looking picture they've ever taken of James Marshall. He was generally disguised as being dirty and unkempt. But James Marshall discovered gold. And it was done because of John Sutter. Because all of those immigrants were coming to California, they were going to need homes. Sutter knew he could make a fortune if he just had lumber to sell. So he contracted with James Marshall to build a lumber mill along the banks of the American River. And it was in the construction of that mill that on January 24th, 1848, they discovered gold. Which this is actually the picture of the mill, and that's James Marshall at the bottom. This is just before the mill was taken down. But it was on that fateful morning of June 24th, as Marshall was observing the mill race, that they found those first few grains that they found those first few grains of gold, much smaller than this particular grain, but it led to the greatest migration of people, of humanity ever, that was not forced by warfare. The gold rush was on. And with the gold rush came a change in Sutter's Fort. It changed from a manufacturing and agricultural center to a purely commercial center. And with this came the arrival of Sutter's eldest son, John Sutter Jr. Now, Sutter, remember, had been in touch with his family. He'd left 16 years earlier at this point, 15 years earlier, but he'd sent for his son to help organize his business. When his son had left Europe, there had not been a discovery of gold. By the time his son arrived in September of 1848, the gold rush was on, and everyone who needed anything had to have money to acquire it. And Sutter, like all farmers, had been borrowing against his harvest and was in debt. And anybody who was owed anything came to John Jr. looking for that money. So John Jr. had to find a way to make money, and one way to do it was to sell property to all these people arriving for the gold rush. This is what the waterfront of Sacramento looked like in 1848. What you see are a few boats and a bunch of trees. This is actually looking right up J Street. But with the Mexican-American War being here, what we also had was the presence of the American Army. So the waterfront we see here, and this is the Sacramento into which later the American Army. This is Peter Burnett. He was the first governor of California. John Sutter Jr. hired him to sell property on the waterfront, and they laid out the city of Sacramento. Now, helping him lay out the city of Sacramento was one of the engineers traveling with the United States Army. And this was William Tecumseh Sherman. We know him as the famous Civil War general, but in 1848, he was with the Engineering Corps. He helped John Sutter Jr., William Walker, and Lansford Hastings lay out what becomes the city of Sacramento. This is the first map that Sherman did of the region. You'll notice in 1848, the only thing there is Sutter's Fort, John Sinclair's place, and if we went further out to the east, we'd see William Leidesdorf's place, but not very much development within the Central Valley. We saw Bidwell's map that showed other things up and down the valley. This is 1849 and what the waterfront looked like in Sacramento. So why did they build Sacramento where it was built? John Sutter didn't want to build it there. He had already laid out a town down near where William Land Park is today, known as Suttersville. But in 1 year, from 1848 to 1849, the waterfront went from a lazy bunch of bushes to a bustling town with wooden buildings. And this picture shows you that by 1849, people were coming here in droves by ships. And this explains why Sacramento was built where it was built. In this picture, do you notice any piers, any docks? No, that's because there aren't any. But one thing that they could do with Sacramento is that they could build it where the one place was you could land ships. Where the American River came into the Sacramento River, the American River carries with it a large suspended sediment load. That sediment load hits the strong current of the Sacramento River and leaves a big sandbank along the east side of the Sacramento River. It was this sandbank that led directly to Sacramento being built where it was, because they could beach the ships up on the sandbank, load and unload them at low tide, and then float them off at high tide. So in 1848, we had a waterfront that was nothing but shrubs and trees. By 1849, we've got a bustling town with wagons and ships and even steamships arriving. Of course, when you build your city where two major rivers come together, those are not wagons in the picture, those are boats. And the city flooded. It flooded in 1850, 51, 52, 53. Finally, in 1853, they were able to build levees to keep out the floodwaters, at least temporarily. What we're going to see here is, so they kept out the floodwaters temporarily. This is the city as it was laid out by William Tecumseh Sherman and William Walker. You'll notice that it's a grid. The key word in Gold Rush is rush. There simply was no time to even name the streets. They're simply numbered and they're lettered. You'll notice that Sutter's Fort is way out to the east there, well back from the general population. And while this map is from 1861, it does give us the same street configuration that existed in 1849 when the city was laid out, and actually December of 1848 when the grid pattern was created. But this map talks about flooding because you cannot separate flooding from Sacramento's history, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. But we have to back up just a little bit to 1850, because remember I said that Sutter had separated from his wife, left her and their children behind in Switzerland. In September of 1850, he reunited with his wife. This is Anna Dubeld Sutter. She and the rest of the children and even the extended family came to join Sutter. He spent $16,000 and paid a man, Heinrich Lienhardt, to go home to gather the family, and they arrived in January of 1850. This is one of the children, Alphonse. I like to think that this picture, and this one is a light emulsion photograph of Alphonse, looks very much like John Sutter looked in his younger years. Though they never lived at Sutter's Fort. In 1849, John Sutter sold the fort for about 7,000 American dollars. Where they lived was Hawk Farm. This is a picture of Hawk Farm. It was Sutter's plantation on the Feather River. It became a center of California agriculture. It's highlighted in many magazine articles from the 1850s. Sutter grew a variety of crops, brought the grape industry into the Central Valley, but also had huge extended gardens, large gatherings, and Hawk Farm, up near where Marysville is today, became the center of California culture and California agriculture during the 1850s. Now, at this time, of course, gold's been discovered and the map of California has changed. Now let's notice that there's very little of the development along the coast, and all of the towns are now to the west or to the east of Sutter's Fort. So Sutter's Fort still sits there, but now all of the development is up in the hills. And this is these are the men that came for the gold rush. These are the men that passed through Sutter's Fort. Aren't they a jaunty looking group? This is the cover of the book, The Rush to Riches by J.S. Holliday. And you'll notice how, the people that came, just like Sutter, the same depression that had hit Europe in the 30s hit the United States in the 40s. And you had lots of men without opportunity. And when gold was discovered, it not only offered opportunity, it offered adventure. And they prepared themselves to come to California. This man I love. If you look closely at this picture, you'll see that he's carrying a double-barrel shotgun. He has a Colt Patterson revolver. He has a Bowie knife. He has a tomahawk. He has another knife. He has a Hawken rifle. And he hasn't even left the East yet. He's just docking himself with all of the materials that he's going to need when he gets to California. Unfortunately, most of those were taken away from him once he got here, and gold mining was not the easy job that people expected it to be. Gold mining was difficult work, and really very few men got rich off of it. This is Charles Knowles painting Sunday Morning at the Mines, and it really tells a great story. You'll see that there are people with the Bible, there are people doing laundry, there are people with horse races, there's fighting, and there's people who have been out too long. But also you'll notice that as the gold rush happened, Sutter, the town of Sacramento was beginning to grow out by the fort. Initially, the fort walls were taken down and the bricks were used to build the first buildings of downtown Sacramento. The Southeast Bastion, which you see in this picture, and the rooms around it, had become a cholera hospital because along with the sudden influx of people, came the influx of disease. There was no sewer system. There were no places to take care of health issues. The first hospitals were built within the Sutter's Fort itself, and in 1857, the walls caved in. So that by 1857, all that remained was this falling down bastion and the central building of Sutter's Fort. As a matter of fact, the flooding had become so great in Sacramento that they actually had to raise the town. Now, this is an image of the flood of 1861-62 up above, and down below shows you underground Sacramento. The flooding was so great in January of 1862 that over the next 5 years, the city of Sacramento was raised almost 14 feet in some areas, and the bottom floors of buildings were simply abandoned. And this is what's known today as Sacramento's underground. Now, this is what led to a lot of the flooding. It wasn't simply bad weather and a lot of rain. This is mining. And while mining began as a man with a pan finding placer gold or little pieces of gold flakes that were in the river, it suddenly progressed to hydraulic mining, where big water cannons known as monitors simply mowed down entire hillsides, entire mountains, as they were searching for gold in the dredgings of all of these different pieces. And here's a picture of you can still see lots of these dredge tailings out by White Rock Road and up in the gold fields, and all of the debris as they washed down these mountainsides flowed into the rivers, filled the channels with all kinds of debris and junk, so that the rivers easily overflowed their banks because their channels were no longer as deep. And that led to serious flooding throughout Sacramento, serious disease problems, and ultimately underground Sacramento. Now, this is what mining actually evolved to. This is underground mining, or where deep mining, where they simply found one of these veins of quartz, gold-bearing quartz, from which the placer gold had eroded, and they could follow it underground for miles. This picture represents the mine up in Auburn, and you'll notice that it's still Empire Mine State Park, and people were traveling literally 2 miles underground in search of gold. So the gold rush didn't end with the building of Sacramento. It continued on into the 1860s and even later. And so why didn't John Sutter why didn't John Sutter get rich from the gold rush? What the heck, he's right next to the gold fields. He had more, than anybody else right there. Why don't you think he got rich? Well, the problem was that to get rich on the gold rush, you had to have capital to capitalize. There was no money in California. You could count on one hand the number of people that got rich off the gold rush. They were people who had worked with John Sutter, those clerks that we pointed to earlier, who knew how to use native people to find gold. But it wasn't until men with connections to Eastern banks got here that you could really get rich off of selling hardware to the gold rush. Wealth is a very relative term. John Sutter was the wealthiest man by California standards. But if Bill Gates today suddenly had to live off of $100,000 a year, he'd think he was dirt poor. If they gave me $100,000 a year, I assure you I just got a big raise to work at Sutter's Fort. So what's wealth is to one person is not wealth to another. John Sutter thought he would be the richest man on the Pacific simply because of all of the property that he owned. But he never was able to experience that great wealth, and it's led to people thinking that Sutter died in poverty. And that simply is not true. As a matter of fact, in 1865, Hawk Farm burned down and John Sutter moved to Washington, D.C. He then inherited grandchildren from his eldest son in 1867. And the house that you just saw on the picture, could we go back to that picture for just a second? This is where Sutter lived out the end of his life. You'll notice that this does not look like someone living in poverty. It is now today known as the General Sutter Inn. But this is the house that John Sutter and his wife Anna built in Lititz, Pennsylvania in 1867 or finished by 1871. It was the only brick, the only three-story, and the only house with hot and cold running water in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So while John Sutter did not experience the great wealth that the men with connections to Eastern banks did, like Huntington, Stanford, Hopkins, the Big Four, John Sutter did not die begging in the streets and did not die in poverty. He managed to live from the time he sold the fort in 1849 till he and his wife both died in 1880 in good style, and he never actually had to have a job during that. This is John Sutter in his elderly years, about the time, 1877, when he gave a statement of his life to Hubert Howe Bancroft, who was the first chair of history at UC Berkeley. And finally here we're going to go to a picture of Sacramento this is the fort actually, in 1867. It has always been a tourist attraction. People wanted to take their pictures, but they also took away anything that was not nailed down. By 1860, the only thing that was left was the central building. This picture is actually from 1867. This picture is from about 1887. And this was at the time that the native sons of the Golden West wanted a memorial to pre-gold rush pioneers. Sutter's Fort was something that most of those people had in common. So they purchased the central building, which still stood in the 2 city blocks around it, and they began a reconstruction of Sutter's Fort. They actually tried to make the fort out of mud brick, just as Sutter had built it. Although in this picture, you'll notice that the south wall is, and this is how they began making the bricks and stabilizing the central building. The walls were then reconstructed out of fired red brick to save money. This is how the central building looks today, and about 70% of the bricks date right to when it was built. About 50% of the supporting woodwork is there. This is a picture of Sacramento in 1862. What you'll notice is that now that there are docks, there are piers, and it's still a major center for the gold rush and for transportation and people coming in even before the Transcontinental Railroad. What you see, that little lake on the left, that's where the Railroad Museum is today. But in 1862, this was known as Lake Sutter, and it was the last remnants of things named for Sutter in Sacramento at that time. And at this time, I'd like to thank you again, Bob.
Take a big deep breath, Steve.
Okay, I'll try to.
That was a long story of Sacramento. A lot of people, it took a lot of people to put this thing together.
Took a lot of people.
Varied types of people that were coming together from different parts of the country and different parts of the world. And just they all came together and tried to tolerate each other, I guess.
That's a good point, Bob.
Work with each other.
Even before the gold rush, the population of Sutter's Fort was incredibly diverse. And if anyone would like to hear more about Sutter's Fort's history or the history of the Sacramento region, I encourage you to visit Sutter's Fort. I will be there myself on the 3rd Saturday of most months. It will be the 2nd Saturday in April. But on the 3rd Saturday of most months, we have a special event known as Hands-On History with a different theme. And you will have about 50 costumed docents who will be there to share history, do demonstrations, and have hands-on activities, not just for the kids, but for adults as well. So if anyone is interested in learning the details behind some of this history, which is hard to give in 1 hour, I encourage you to visit me at Sutter's Fort. And thank you again, Bob. And thanks to Living in the West magazine.
Don't you even have the little doll down there?
Dolly is on display daily at Sutter's Fort. And she survived that terrible winter in the mountains of the Donner Party.
Right. Well, listen, thanks for joining me, Steve.
Thank you.
As always, we put together another history lesson for the people out there to learn about where they live and find out how nice it really is to be living in the West. Thanks for joining us.